And here we are back with another ship review. This time around the rank 4 German coastal vessel sitting at a battle rating of 2.7, AF-D1. This barge is armed with two single-mount 88mm guns. These guns have the choice between high explosive and high explosive fragmentation incendiary rounds. The exact difference between the two rounds is unclear to me, as statistically speaking they're identical. I've personally been using the high explosive fragmentation incendiary shells, but again I really don't know the difference between these two shells. When it comes to reload rate, they can reload every 5.2 to 4 seconds depending on crew skill. Together with this somewhat mediocre reload speed, the gun traverse is also nothing too impressive, sitting at 10 to 12 degrees per second of horizontal traverse rate. In terms of survivability, it's a bit awkward. You see, they have these gun shields around them, and these gun shields are made out of 15mm of anti-fragmentation armor. The problem is that that armor doesn't really stop any kind of shell at this battle rating. And all it really does is make the hitbox of the gun bigger, meaning that it gets knocked out easier. So yeah, a little bit awkward. All in all, the guns aren't bad, they're nothing particularly impressive. They don't one-shot most coastals, but they do pack a pretty decent punch. And they are pretty much your only long-range option. Because other than the 88s, your secondary armament is 2 quadruple 20mm and 1 single 15mm. The 15mm gun carries an APIT belt, and the 20mm have a choice between armor-piercing and high-explosive belts of various mixtures. After expanding its ammo belt, the 15mm gun will reload in 5.85 to 4.5 seconds depending on crew skill. For the 20mm guns, this is 7.8 to 6 seconds. When it comes to horizontal traverse rates, these guns are a fair bit quicker. For the 20s, this is 30 to 35 degrees per second, and the 15s 64 to 75 degrees per second. The 15mm gun is largely forgettable, as it only really has a firing arc towards the rear of the vessel. The 20mm guns have a bit of a similar issue when it comes to survivability. They have these large anti-fragmentation gun shields, but they're not actually armored enough to stop anything, and all that gun shield does is make the hitbox bigger. So yeah, you can lose these guns fairly often and fairly quickly. Sadly, despite being the secondary weapon group, they cannot be controlled together with the main guns, unlike some other coastals. And it is a bit of a difficult choice, choosing between whether or not you should be using the 20mm guns manually or the 88s. Personally, I've noticed that using the 88s for the first long-range engagements or maybe the first opening salvo can be a good idea, and then using the 20s to finish off a quicker maneuvering target or just getting that last little bit of damage done. We have one more gun left on the AF-D1, and that is the single 37mm gun just in front of the bridge. This gun is only equipped with a high explosive shell, and no other alternatives are available. It does have a relatively impressive reload rate of 2.6 to 2 seconds, depending on crew skill again. This sits in a fairly unarmored single mount, but the lack of a gun shield is actually a benefit to its survivability. Its traverse rate can vary between 17 and 20 degrees per second, depending on your modifications. Despite this being a 37mm gun, this is not an automatic anti-aircraft gun. It isn't terrible for anti-air duties luckily, but it's not too reliably either. As an anti-surface gun, it's also not going to be your first choice to use manually. The 88s pack a greater punch and the 20s have a higher volume of fire. All in all, this gun exists on the ship, and can prove useful every now and then. But it's not really a key part of the armament. Outside of the gun armament, the AF-D1 can also carry 4 depth charges, 2 on either side mounted on the rear of the vessel. These have a payload of 130 kilograms of TNT. Not all that useful, especially on a slow barge, and like most depth charges just don't really have a use case. Though it has gotten me killed when using a different boat when I faced an AF-D1. So it might come in handy in those very rare situations where people try to get behind you at very close range. When it comes to mobility, it is as you could expect from a barge. Its top speed varies between 17 and 19.8 kilometers an hour. The rudder response is rather slow. The size of the turning circle decreases noticeably when upgraded, though it still isn't very fast in the turn. Engine responsiveness is alright. It certainly doesn't get in the way of the already poor top speed, at least. Survivability is a bit more interesting for the ship, as it does actually have some armor. Previously noted the gun shields, but the 37mm gun sits in a 100mm thick concrete tub, and the superstructure is also armored with 2 layers of 100mm of concrete, which does provide some protection. The main hull also has some actual armor steel plating, though not an awful lot of it. It does, however, cover the main magazine, somewhat, as well as the rear magazine. What should be noted though is that despite the magazines being protected by some armor, they do still sit fairly noticeably above the waterline. And whilst that armor is better than nothing, it won't stop most medium caliber coastal guns. Now, that is not to say that the AF-D1 is not resilient to small arms fire. It is quite tough. And even a few of the larger autocannons like 37s or 40s can struggle with it at range. It is nowhere near immortal, of course, but noticeably more resilient than the average coastal vessel. And it really needs that resilience because there is no chance of removing yourself from a difficult situation. In terms of playstyle, this may sound odd, but with the recent changes to vehicle pools that AI ships can spawn, and other matchmaking stuff, it seems to have revitalized coastal matchmaking a lot, where when you now play these lower or even the middle coastal battle ratings, you will fight on a lot more actual coastal maps. So AF-D1 has been an interesting ship to pick up again. It has given a previously worthless ship a role again, and if I were to describe it, it is the backbone of a team's offense. Its bulk and survivability and not insignificant firepower can make it a good centerpiece for a capture point push. But there is a downside. This ideally requires support. AF-D1 is not the tip, the spear. It cannot rush into danger, hell, it can't rush into anything really. But it can take a beating and go toe-to-toe with some other big coastals. In short, support your team, go where they are, and focus on other tough nuts to crack. Don't be afraid to stay at range either. As long as you have sightlines on enemy positions, you will be useful. Another thing to note compared to Blue Water reviews is that coastals are much more likely to sink during battle. So if you do get sunk, so be it. But do your best to go down swinging. This boat does really allow for you to do that. So in summary, its firepower is good, it doesn't hull break boats, and it doesn't pair with your secondary guns, but it's still potent. Your anti-air armament is pretty decent, but don't trust it fully. The 20mm guns can be a little bit inaccurate, and the 37 is lackluster as a long-range anti-air gun. When it comes to explosive armament, they're an afterthought. It's for depth charges, they exist. In some really niche cases they can be useful, but just forget about them for the most part. Mobility is poor, but that is to be expected from a barge. Survivability is above average for the hull, but the guns are large targets and do get knocked out frequently and quite easily. And its playstyle is second line offense. Verdict: consider it. This is a really difficult verdict for me. The recent change to matchmaking has been very nice for coastal, but at the end of the day, it's still a slow barge that can face destroyers. I have really been enjoying playing coastal these past days and weeks, though I understand not everybody will. So while I did give it a considerate verdict, it is teetering on a skip it. As usual, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.